Wyoming has had a place in the construction and defense of the United States since before it was even a territory. The conquest of the West over the indigenous tribes in the 19th century put the region on the front lines to unite the country, coast to coast, under one nation. The Army forts for those wars were the foundation for America's role in the First World War, and that in turn led to a big influence in the Second World War. It was not until the Cold War that Wyoming would become the focus of the nation's defense, and with that, a bullseye for a foreign attack. In the spring of 1867, General Grenville Dodge and his close friend General Christopher Auger were riding out ahead of the rail workers that were laying the line for the Transcontinental Railroad to the east. They reached a site at a place known as Crow Creek, and it had good water, which was a necessity for locomotives to refuel at the time. They recognized that Crow Creek also lay as a midpoint between Fort Laramie to the north and the new Denver City to the south. And as such, this would not only probably be a place that had the railroad passing through on its east-west transcontinental line, but also on a north-south line. It was going to be a major stop. Two generals decided the location would be known as Cheyenne Stop. And this was in honor of a peaceful band of that indigenous tribe that had recently suffered an unprovoked and horrible attack by a colonel named John Shivington. This took place at Sand Creek, Colorado. And as an aside, most of the military was appalled with what Shivington had done. He had ordered his men to go in and randomly kill Cheyenne and Arapaho, who were peaceful. They were flying the American flag. They had no intention of fighting anyone. And he just ordered his men to go in and kill as many of them as they could. Well, these two generals hated this guy for it and felt bad for the Cheyenne, so they named the stop Cheyenne Stop. For what it's worth, their boss, General William Tecumseh Sherman, agreed with them. The name Cheyenne Stop stuck. As a station with the likely future of being a junction of east-west and north-south rail lines, Cheyenne Stop would also get a fort. The two generals dubbed that new installation to be Fort D.A. Russell, after a fellow Union general who had been killed in the Civil War in 1864. Within months, Cheyenne Stop was a hell-on-wheels town where the rail workers were based as they built the railroad to the west over Sherman Summit. Many of the people who flocked to Cheyenne Stop spent the winter here, almost 6,000 of them. And when spring came around, a lot of those people decided, we don't really want to move. We like it here. They also decided they'd drop the word stop from the town's name. And with that, Cheyenne was born. Fort D.A. Russell was built to help defend the railroad and the town of Cheyenne during Red Cloud's War and the Great Sioux War. But it never really had to do that, as Fort Laramie, to the north, kept that role during the Western Conquest. Nevertheless, Fort D.A. Russell grew as a U.S. cavalry base, with troops serving from the fort in the Spanish-American War in 1901 and the Mexican-American War in 1913 to 1916. As a cavalry base, Fort Russell, in combination with another military facility that sprang up called Camp Carlin, became the Army's second largest quartermaster station. There were huge corrals holding the mules and horses that were here, and many of those animals went off to the First World War. In fact, Wyoming quarter horses became famous in France as the best animals in the war. They were heralded as being sturdy under fire and needing less food and water than other breeds. This installation grew in prominence after the Great War, when the U.S. Postal Service decided to begin transcontinental mail routes with airplanes. Fort D.A. Russell was important to the Postal Service for the same reason that Fort D.A. Russell and Cheyenne had been important to the railroad. It was near the highest point on the transcontinental route. Therefore, airplanes needed to be serviced to get over what we commonly call Sherman Summit, but was then, by the Postal Service, deemed the hump. During the Second World War, Fort Russell became a major repair station for B-17 bombers. That particular plane took on a modification in Cheyenne that made it far more dangerous to German fighter pilots. In Cheyenne, they began installing a tail gunner turret that could effectively fire on German planes coming up from behind. This became the B-17G, and the modification was known as the Cheyenne Tail. But it was the Cold War where Fort D.A. Russell again moved into the front line of the nation's defense. And that's the place it remains to this day. In 1947, the military created the Air Force from what had been the Army Air Corps. A number of Army bases, like Fort D.A. Russell, went with the Air Force. Fort D.A. Russell was then renamed Francis E. Warren Air Force Base after the late senator and governor who had been so instrumental in Wyoming's growth over the previous 50 years. Soon after World War II, the United States found itself in an arms race with the Soviet Union. And not only were large aircraft a part of that race, but so were the newly developed missiles that could strike targets thousands of miles away. Being further than most bases from the Soviet Union and its submarine fleet, Warren Air Force Base was deemed the perfect place to host our nuclear missiles. Thus, in 1960, the base became the home of one of our first intercontinental ballistic missiles, the Atlas. Atlas missiles were designed to be launched from underground bunkers, and these subterranean silos were dug into the prairie around Cheyenne. In the mid-60s, those Atlas missiles were upgraded to Minuteman missiles, and that upgrade has led to the base now being home to the 90th Missile Wing and the Minuteman III, our most advanced ICBM. As the base for our most advanced weapon system, any country wanting to challenge us in a major war would want to destroy those missiles. That thus makes Warren Air Force Base and Southeast Wyoming a prime target in such a war. We like to say the Cold War came to an end with the downfall of the Soviet Union, but the reality is that Russia took control of the Soviet ICBM fleet. Many of those missiles have been decommissioned in a drawback from Cold War numbers, but there are roughly 1,500 nuclear warheads on missiles and in aircraft, ready to be used against the United States. It is safe to assume that a large number of those weapons are currently aimed at Warren Air Force Base and the missile silos of southeast Wyoming. If a world war were to break out, Wyoming would thus be the front line. In February of 2022, Vladimir Putin, who is essentially the dictator of Russia, attacked his neighbor, Ukraine, again, and threatened the other powers of the world that if they intervened, they could be subject to nuclear annihilation. He then reportedly readied his missiles, fueling them and doing various upgrades, and put the world in a state it hasn't been in since the early 1980s. Right now, we don't know how many nuclear weapons are aimed at southeast Wyoming, but one would guess with 1,500 active nuclear weapons in the Russian arsenal, at least 20 of them are aimed at Wyoming. It is disconcerting, at the very least, to think someone has you in their nuclear crosshairs. But the fact is, if the Russians fired on Cheyenne, it would mean they would also fire at bases like Hill Air Force Base in Ogden, Utah, the various missile bases in central Montana, and of course the NORAD base in Colorado Springs, not to mention all the major military facilities in large cities around the United States and across Europe. Nuclear fallout would be everywhere, and the world as we know it would be as finished as it was for the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. The nuclear genie is out of the bottle, and you can't put it back in. It's a sobering fact, but if there's a third world war, it's going to be nuclear, and Wyoming will be on the front line. Albert Einstein was once asked what he thought the weapons would be like in World War III, and his response was, "I don't know, but in World War IV, they're going to be sticks and stones." We're just going to have to hope that cooler heads prevail and we don't have a World War III.
Yeah.